Good morning. I'd like to welcome members of the public to this accountability and performance meeting. I'm Jonathan Ash-Edwards, the Police and Crime Commissioner for Hertfordshire. I'm joined by Andy Prophet, the Chief Constable of Hertfordshire Constabulary. Before getting into today's agenda, I'm going to just outline the purpose of this meeting and our respective roles and responsibilities for clarity. As the Police and Crime Commissioner, I'm elected by the public to have oversight of the police in Hertfordshire. That means that I set the strategic priorities through a police and crime plan, which was published last week, and I hold the constabulary through the Chief Constable to account on behalf of the public. I do not have any involvement in operational police decisions. That is because the police are operationally independent in law. The Chief Constable is the most senior police officer in the county and runs the constabulary. He's answerable to the law for the use of police powers and accountable to me for the constabulary's work and performance. After my election in May last year, I established these accountability and performance meetings to help me undertake my statutory duty to hold the Chief Constable to account, and they're webcast to the public because I think it's important that there is transparency in these conversations. Ordinarily, these meetings would not discuss individual cases because my role is strategic in nature. However, because of the very significant media coverage of one case involving Hertfordshire Constabulary in recent days, I'm making an exception today. And therefore, the first item on the agenda will be the police's involvement in a case involving a primary school and family in Borehamwood. Because of the addition to the agenda, I've made some changes to the pre-published agenda that was set out last week. We'll continue to discuss neighbourhood policing and residential burglary as planned, but the other planned agenda items on rural crime, firearms licensing, and the recommendations from the constabulary's last inspection report will be deferred to the next meeting. Members of the public are very welcome to the meeting. The webcast is in watch-only mode. There's no facility to ask questions or participate, but I hope you find the conversation the Chief Constable and I will have useful. I'm going to turn first then to the case in Borehamwood that's been in the national news over the last few days. Following the publication of the story in the Times on Friday night, I made contact with the Chief Constable to ask for an update. The Chief Constable agreed to undertake a review in order to provide an explanation today as to the circumstances of the police's involvement. I want to put on record at the outset that I'm grateful to the Chief Constable for the transparency he's provided to me and my office in this matter to help me fulfil my statutory duties. I've also spoken with both the family and the school to hear their respective perspectives. Chief Constable, can I start by asking you to outline the timeline of the constabulary's involvement in this case, please?
Yes, I can. Good morning, Commissioner. So since June last year, June 2024, there have been a breakdown of relationships between a family and a school, Cowley Hill Primary School. Hertfordshire Constabulary was first contacted in June last year by the school to report that two parents of a child at the school were, in the view of the school, conducting a campaign through social media of I'll use the word harassment against that school. Officers looked at that in June, didn't believe there was any criminal offences, and advice was given to the parties. There was then further contact from the school to the constabulary in July of last year that the school had taken a decision to ban the parents from the school because of the concerns about the behaviour that was alleged. The next contact with the constabulary was in November last year, again from the school, saying that the behaviour from the family in the school's view was continuing, was described as unpleasant, persistent, undermining but not threatening. And again, the police provided words of advice to the family members to say that perhaps they want to reflect on that behaviour because it's causing concern within the school community. Move forward to December of last year, we had further contact from the school reporting that email communications from the family were continuing, described as more than 20 further emails since the last contact. And at that point in December, a decision was taken because of the course of conduct was continuing, because there was alarm and distress being caused by two members of the school community, in particular the head, that a report of harassment will be formally recorded on the Hertfordshire Constabulary crime system. Move forward to the 20th of December. The concerns for the school continued, and an officer from Hertfordshire Constabulary contacted the family and a third party and offered through email advice to carefully consider the behaviour and desist from it, because concerns of harassment were continuing from members at the school, and that we encouraged them to stop that behaviour so it didn't escalate any further. So that was in December. As a result of that contact, a public complaint was received from those parties, which was recorded and investigated. But that was of an officer trying to say to the family and that third party, can you please stop this behaviour? It is escalating and it's causing distress to members of the school community. Move forward to the end of January, that behaviour continued to be reported from the school. There was more persistent contact and communication, which led to a decision by an officer of inspector rank that we tried to mediate, we tried to reason, we tried to rationalise, we tried to encourage parties to think about their behaviour, all sadly to no avail. And the decision was made to arrest 2 family members on suspicion of harassment. And that arrest was carried out. The 2 members of the family that were arrested were subject to an interview at a police station, were released on bail. The evidence was considered in the round, and a decision was taken, I believe, last week that despite the volume of information and the volume of contact, it didn't meet the threshold for a charge, and no further action was communicated back to the family, at which point I believed we received the further contact expressing concern about the manner in which, in particular, the arrest was made in January. So that's a summary of the timeline, Commissioner.
Thank you, Chief Constable, for that. And so considerable contact from June onwards, and a considerable period of time where officers were seeking to manage that through words of advice is what you're saying, before the decision to make the arrest in January.
Correct.
Can I ask then, just for clarity then, on what led to that decision to make the arrest, and with the benefit of hindsight, was that the right approach?
Yes. So the decision to arrest, as I've said, was made by an inspector, and it was rationalised on the basis that we have tried, working with the school, working with the family, working with partners, to deal with this matter in a reasonable, negotiated solution, all of which came to no avail. We did have a statement from the head of the school, who described to us the impact on them as an individual of this, what they report as a campaign of undermining, of intimidation, that they believe was significantly impacting upon them. The law, and of course I'm answerable to the law and the officers are answerable to the law, defines harassment really clearly, and it's a really broad definition. The Protection of Harassment Act 1997, Commissioner, and it says any behaviour intended to cause harassment, alarm or distress, so a pretty broad category, alarm or distress, on one or more occasion, that does not have to be the same type of behaviour and can include digital communication like text or voicemail or email or WhatsApp. So a crime had been recorded, a warning had been given to stop that crime in December. It wasn't well received because we got a public complaint for trying to resolve it that way in December. So a decision was taken. We need to investigate this crime, and an arrest is the right way to do it. That was the decision that was recorded, because we tried every other way to support the victim in the crime that was alleged. So the arrest was a decision-making tool to investigate that properly, fairly and impartially.
Thank you. And with the benefit of hindsight and the review you've been able to undertake, was that the right approach?
I think the arrest was lawful. I think there was a lawful reason to arrest. I think with the benefit of hindsight, we could have achieved the same ends in a different way. And I spoke at length yesterday to many of the officers involved, including the officer who took the decision that arrest was the right route. And part of the rationale that officer had was he did not believe that the family members would comply with any requests for a voluntary interview. He did not believe that. And of course, part of that investigation was to recover electronic devices from the family to check exactly the nature of the communications that had and hadn't been made. And again, the officer did not believe that voluntarily we would have been successful at securing that. I believe with the benefit of hindsight, we probably could have had a conversation with the family and said, we do have powers here. We don't wish to use those powers. We can use those powers. Can we get to a sensible way of having a conversation with you about this matter we now need to formally investigate? Nevertheless, that was not the decision was taken. The arrest was lawful. I think in hindsight, we could have done it differently.
Okay, thank you. That's useful clarity. One of the points that I think has come out of the public sort of debate about this matter in recent days is around the number of officers that were then deployed to make that arrest. Six officers deployed. With the benefit of hindsight, was that the right approach in terms of the number of officers deployed to make that arrest?
So let me explain the rationale that the decision maker gave to me, because I think that's important context. So the decision maker took a conscious decision to send 6 officers, and I've looked at the footage, and again, I understand why a member of the public would look at that and think that feels a little bit over the top. Did we really need 6 officers there? The rationale that the decision maker gave on this was that I knew I was going there with the intention of arresting 2 people who I wanted to take to custody separately to minimise their opportunity to talk. 2 officers take one person, 2 officers take the second person, which leaves me with 2 officers there to do things like search the premises and deal with any other family members that might be there. So that was the rationale for 6 people being deployed. Again, I've had a look at that. I've talked to the officers. With the benefit of hindsight, I think we could have done that and should have done that differently. We may have needed 6 people, but they didn't all need to be uniformed officers. We didn't need 3 marked vehicles and a police van parked outside, and we probably could have achieved it with 1 or 2 uniformed officers. And if we needed some people to go and support, we could have thought about officers in plain clothes and dealing with it a little bit lower key. That is with the benefit of hindsight, and I had that conversation and debriefed all concerned on that point.
Thank you for that. There's been concern expressed about the police communication in December that you referred to in the timeline that then generated the public complaint that effectively suggested that local politicians could become part of the investigation, and obviously that's generated some public comment around the role of elected representatives. Can you provide an explanation of that and what the officer was seeking to do there?
Yes, I can. And I mean, at the outset, on the broader point, there's a really important role for local politicians to play in holding public bodies like the police to account, and I think that's fundamentally important to democracy in this country. This specific case, a county councillor in mid to late December was emailed by the officer at the same time as the family were emailed saying, can you please be aware that you're continuing communication with the school, because the county councillor had started to communicate with the school along the same theme that the family had been communicating with the school for several months prior, after the point at which the family had been effectively banned from the school. So the email to the county council was, can you just be aware that we have now recorded a harassment crime, and we're asking you just to be aware of that and think through any action you do or don't take. So I absolutely understand, that local county councils and politicians have a really important independent role to play. What the officers were trying to do was effectively avoid the matter becoming more convoluted and more complex than it needed to.
Thank you. I want to ask a question about the wider context that the constabulary is operating in relation to these questions of harassment, and because they obviously sit against other issues, other crimes, other priorities, and there's obviously a balance that you and your officers need to achieve in terms of the the kind of relative prioritisation of that matter. What's your perspective on that in terms of what the constabulary is being asked to do, both by the law and by public reports, in relation to harassment compared to other priorities?
Thank you. And so at the outset, I want an officers, staff and volunteers in Hertfordshire Constabulary want to be tackling violent crime on our streets, violence against women and girls, sexual offending, neighbourhood crime, burglary, robbery, street theft, car theft, shoplifting. That's what we want to be doing, and what I know the public of Hertfordshire want us to do. In the autumn of last year, Hertfordshire was inspected by His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, and we were graded as inadequate for recording crime, because we more or less missed 1 in 5 crimes were not recorded where a victim should have that crime recorded. A significant proportion of those crimes that the constabulary did not properly record and should were harassment. So we're now recording those properly. What does that look like? Every year, about 6,000 crimes are of a harassment nature. That's a law of this country. It is a crime, as I described to you earlier, so it needs to be recorded and it needs to be investigated. Now, the trick here is that not every harassment looks the same. Some of those harassments will be from maybe a domestically violent, abusive relationship where there's coercion, there's control, there's significant criminal history, there's threats of violence and damage. And there is obviously and clearly a role for officers to play that probably is going to be quite clear in terms of an arrest and an intervention. There are other harassments, maybe at the other end of the spectrum, where the definition is met for a crime, but maybe there's no direct threats, there's no direct intimidation, but the behaviour is causing harassment, alarm and distress. And what my officers need to do, and this is a fine line sometimes, is assess that context and decide what's the right way to investigate this crime. And perhaps sometimes as well, kind of reflecting forward, is there more we can build into the kind of partnership structures in Hertfordshire about better mediation, more mediation, so it takes it away from the need for officers to be knocking on a door or asking people for voluntary interviews or otherwise. So there's a huge amount of context about recording crime here. It's a big challenge. We're up for it and we're thinking really thoughtfully about it, but it is a lot of work that we need to get right.
Thank you. And it's not lost on me that criticism of the constabulary that was made in the autumn of last year in relation to the recording of those matters by the inspectorate, and indeed the work that the constabulary is now doing to address those recommendations. I think that context is useful in terms of the volume of cases where the public are making allegations and asking the police to consider matters under that legislation. I think that is useful to understand. So with that context, with the kind of outline of the case and the reflections that you've already made in terms of could have dealt with the arrest in a different way, could have dealt with the deployment of officers in a different way, what are the overall conclusions that you've drawn from the review you've undertaken of the constabulary's approach to this case?
I think the overall conclusions I've drawn is that this has been a really difficult 3 days for the constabulary in terms of, obviously the scrutiny has been brought on the organisation and our leadership and our decision making. But ultimately, I accept that as Chief Constable. I'm accountable to the law. I'm accountable to the public of Hertfordshire through you for the actions of my officers. We have had and will have a really careful kind of debrief around that. One of the pieces of work I've urgently commissioned against those 6,000 things we have to make the right decision on every year, with officers and staff, many of whom are learning their job, are relatively young in service, so I need to support them, trust them and empower them to make these difficult decisions. And there's always two sides to a story, but we're going to have a really careful thought about how we categorise our approach right. And I think, as I said in the previous answer, there's some things at one end of the spectrum, it's obvious where the cops should be. And there are some things in the middle or the other end of the spectrum where we need to be really thoughtful about how we engage on some of these things. Context is everything. Policing is a difficult art sometimes, and sometimes we will make decisions that not everybody will agree with. but ultimately I have to be answerable to the law and support my officers' staff in doing the best they can interpreting that. That's my commitment. That's my focus day in, day out. For as long as I'm serving as Chief Constable, that's what I'm going to be doing.
Thank you, Chief Constable. That's useful, and I think that approach is helpful, and public confidence I think is really important in terms of the balance that the police strike on these kinds of matters. Thank you. I'm grateful for the account that you've provided and the approach that you have explained there on that matter. Thank you. I'm going to move now to our next agenda item, which is on neighbourhood policing and the uplift that the government is wanting to see for neighbourhood policing. Hertfordshire has been allocated £3 million to increase the number of officers in neighbourhood roles through this year, which I think is welcome. Public want to see the police being visible in local communities, out on patrol, dealing with the kind of crimes that you were referring to in terms of the burglary, the shop theft, antisocial behaviour, and so on. Can you outline for me and provide me with an update on how the constabulary is looking to allocate that funding to increase the number of officers in neighbourhood roles?
Yes, Commissioner. And as you say, this is great news. £3 million of extra policing coming into Hertfordshire. That will be 20 additional police and community support officers into our neighbourhood teams and 25 additional police officers into our neighbourhood policing teams. So in the Q1 of next year, April through to June, those 25 officers will land on our neighbourhood policing teams. As you say, they'll be in our town centres, in our parks, in our hotspots, dealing with the neighbourhood crimes we all want to crack down on: car theft, burglary, shop theft, street violence. And in Q2, so July through to September, we will be bringing the 20 additional PCSOs on. So really getting on with it front-footed. This is really good news, and just means that I've got more capacity to do what the public of Hertfordshire want us to do: prevent crime and arrest criminals.
Thank you. That is indeed really positive news. And so in terms of the timescales for implementation, we're saying across Q1 and Q2, so by the back end of the summer, those officers in neighbourhood roles. And are you confident about the deliverability of that timescale in terms of either the recruitment or redeployment of those people?
Yes, I've asked the team for a detailed breakdown, Commissioner, as you'd expect. So from recruitment to training to getting them out on the street, it's an ambitious timeline, but I'm confident that we can meet that timeline. We've been for 3 or 4 years now growing as a constabulary with really clear kind of year end and midpoint uplift targets, and we've met those consistently. So the machinery of recruitment, training and onboarding is in a good place, and I'm confident we'll deliver to the times I've said.
Thank you. And it's very positive news, and it's what the public want to see in local neighbourhoods. In terms of how those officers are deployed in your expectation, what impact do you want those officers to be having in communities? How will you be monitoring it, the kind of intentions of putting more officers into neighbourhoods to get more officers on patrol to be dealing with those priority neighbourhood crimes? How will you ensure that is happening through that uplift?
I think first and foremost, I want us to be more visible, and I want the communities of Hertfordshire to see and feel that visibility. So there's a tacit recognition of, it looks like there's more cops around. That's a really important thing. And I'm working now with the team on what that visibility plan looks like. And clearly that's about deploying in the right places at the right times and doing the right police work, but then communicating that really effectively to communities so they know what we've done. So visibility, dealing with crime. more arrests, more out of court disposals, more interventions on the street for shop theft, for antisocial behaviour, for kind of street crime and car crime. Those neighbourhood crimes that the public say they really want us to crack down on, and I want us to crack down. More use of stop and search, more intelligence submissions around local criminals, a greater preventative approach. So we're proactively monitoring those people who we know are repeat offenders. So that kind of preventative, front-footed problem solving in our communities, measured by activity and measured by the public saying we see it, we feel it, and it's making a difference. Yeah.
Thank you. And I very much welcome that, and very much aligned with the direction of travel for the Police and Crime Plan to be really focused on those neighbourhood crimes that the public want to see addressed. And I think that visibility in community is critical too, both in terms of making people feel safe, but also that public confidence as well. So I very much welcome that, and if the Home Secretary's got any more funding, we will happily take it as well. Thank you. Really looking forward to seeing those additional officers going into neighbourhood teams, and no doubt we'll return later in the year to some of the work they've been doing and the impact that they've been having. Thank you for that update. I'm going to turn now to residential burglary, and I wanted to just get an update from the Chief Constable after the winter, which is often the sort of peak, busier time of year for residential burglary, on how the last few months have gone, and indeed the sort of end of policing performance year. Update on residential burglary. It's one of the things that the public raised with me the most as an area of concern. Burglary is fairly low in Hertfordshire, but it is a crime that really impacts people's sense of safety in their own home, and their absolute right to be safe in their own home. And there is a lot of work across the constabulary to try and address this. So can I have an update on how that has gone through the winter months, please?
You can, Commissioner. It's a horrible crime, breaking into people's home. I dislike burglars intensively, as do the people of Hertfordshire, and we need to crack down on this really, really clearly. We do have a plan. The constabulary has an operation called Operation Guardian. It's a force-wide campaign designed to do exactly that: reduce burglary and arrest and tackle and lock up burglars. There are seasonal variations in the patterns of burglary that we see as the clocks go back in the winter and the nights draw in and get darker. We tend to see an increase in burglary because there's that cover of darkness. At certain times of the year, certain faith communities, we see family gold burglaries spike. So we can plan and are planning for these predictable events that happen, so we're in the right place with the right kind of interventions as a policing team. But we're also working with communities so they can, so perhaps particular communities, if they are from a particular faith and do have, particular times of year where they might be vulnerable to burglary, we can give crime prevention advice around safes and windows and locks and security lighting. So all that's part of it as well. Of course, as well as working with our partners and our cadets and using all our kind of communication channels to really try and make Hertfordshire a hostile place. We are having some success in this space. So if I just take the last couple of weeks, a man from Cambridge was charged with 5 dwelling burglaries in Watford and Kings Langley just last month. Another gentleman from Stevenage was arrested and charged with 3 dwelling burglaries locally to Stevenage. And recently in St Albans, again, another gentleman was charged with an aggravated burglary where a Rolex watch was stolen. So there is proactive work. We are arresting burglars. We are locking them up and charging them with the support of the Crown Prosecution Service and the courts. There is more work to do. I'm not complacent. There were 1,709 homes, so excluding sheds in garages and outbuildings, 1,709 homes were broken into in Hertfordshire between the 1st of April last year and the end of February. That is a small reduction on the same period the previous year of about 4%. I don't rest on my laurels. I take no comfort in that, because 1,709 is about 1,709 too many, if that's your home. So we have seen a small reduction. We, again, looking at the winter period, period, October to February last year, again, we saw a small reduction, but we've got more work to do, and we will absolutely be focused on it. Going back to, where we started talking today, this is what I want, and this is what officers want to be cracking down in, the breaking into people's homes, the locking up of burglars. I've also asked the constabulary to come up with a really clear plan around who are our core offenders. It's not rocket science, I know, but who are our prolific, most high risk and repeat offenders. Quite often there's organised criminality around burglaries where cars are stolen, where jewellery is stolen, as I've said, and we need to be in and under the skin of those people, using overt tactics in hotspots and patrols, and using covert tactics to do smart investigation to get behind these things. And that is my commitment, and what part of what I'm absolutely certain everybody in Hertfordshire Constabulary wants to achieve.
Thank you. That's a really useful update, and 4% reduction year on year in burglary across Hertfordshire is certainly welcome news. As you said, still one is too many, but direction of travel there positive, and useful to hear some of those examples in terms of arrests and charges, and the work that you're doing. Sort of behind that, because obviously one of the things we've talked about previously is around catching more burglars and solving more burglary, and so the work you're doing there is welcome in that direction. What do you see as the kind of next steps for that work in terms of that really being embedded, really having impact, and perhaps thinking ahead to as burglary begins to tick up a bit as you get back later in the year to the kind of darker evenings? Are you confident with the work you've put in place that will begin to bear real fruit?
Yeah, I am. One of the things I've asked, Hertfordshire is currently, as you know, Commissioner, there's 10 district council areas. In each of those district council areas, I have a chief inspector who runs the local response, investigation and neighbourhood team. One of the things I'm working with the chief inspectors, and we've got a really clear crime fighting and community engagement plan with our key partners, council, probation, communities, to address the things we want to achieve. So I think one of the things I really want to be ahead of the autumn this year, when the knives draw in and we tend to see that increase, is that we've got all our ducks lined up as a community safety broad partnership. So we absolutely know from East Herts through to Decorum, we've got a clear understanding of what our intelligence says is likely to happen and how we're going to do everything we can to try and prevent it. As I say, through hotspot patrols, through targeting offenders, through trying to help and encourage victims to think about crime prevention advice, through to good old-fashioned policing and disrupting and arresting those people who we know will be committing the burglaries. So I just want us to be even better at it and drive even more success.
Great, thank you. And I know that's what people in Hertfordshire want to see the constabulary doing, and very much what I'm keen to be happening as well. And so no doubt we'll come back and have further discussions around that later in the year to see how that work is going. Thank you. I'm going to draw the meeting to a close there. We obviously had a slightly different agenda today, but I think important that there was some scrutiny and transparency around that case that's been in the national news, and then useful to get those updates around neighbourhood policing and burglary, and the other pre-planned agenda items we'll defer to our meeting next month. Thank you, Chief Constable. I'll draw the meeting to a close there.
Thank you.